So, hello and welcome back yet again as I keep adjusting where you're sitting, even though I already started recording, because that's just how I manage to do things from time to time. How are you guys all doing? I hope that you are looking forward as much as I am to volume 2, where hopefully we'll get a little bit of perspective from Victor Frankenstein's monster. I'm just going to keep putting that in air quotes because until or unless we're proven differently as we go through this, I think the real monster of Frankenstein is Victor. I mean, he does not come off as a very sympathetic protagonist, which is fine. You definitely want flaws in your protagonist, but you also want him to be a little bit likable, and save for a little while when he was in his very young childhood, he seems a little bit pompous to me. That's just a me reading on it. You might like him better, and that is probably just as valid. But yeah, he didn't come off real good in that first volume. So I guess we're going to jump back in, and we are going to be reading volume 2 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, beginning with chapter 1. We'll be doing 2 chapters a night like we did in the first one. So, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, volume 2, chapter 1. Nothing is more painful to the human mind than after the feelings have been worked up by a quick succession of events, the dead calmness of inaction and certainty which follows and deprives the soul both of hope and fear. Justine died. She rested, and I was alive. The blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed on my heart, which nothing could remove. Side note, looks like we're still with Victor. The blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed on my heart, which nothing could remove. Sleep fled from my eyes. I wandered like an evil spirit, for I had committed deeds of mischief beyond description, horrible, and more, much more, I persuaded myself, was yet behind. Yet my heart overflowed with kindness and the love of virtue. I had begun life with benevolent intentions and thirsted for the moment when I should put them in practice and make myself useful to my fellow beings. Now all was blasted. Instead of the serenity of conscience, which allowed me to look back upon the past with self-satisfaction, and from thence to gather promise of new hope, I was seized by remorse and the sense of guilt, which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures such as no language can describe. This state of mind preyed upon my health, which had perhaps never entirely recovered from the first shock I had sustained. I shunned the face of man. All sound of joy or complacency was a torture to me. Solitude was my only consolation. Deep, dark, death-like solitude. My father observed with pain the alteration perceptible in my disposition and habits, and endeavored by arguments, deduced from the feelings of his serene conscience and his guiltless life, to inspire me with fortitude, and awaken in me the courage to dispel the dark cloud that brooded over me. "Do you think, Victor," he said, "that I do not suffer also? No one could love a child more than I loved your brother." Tears came into his eyes as he spoke. "But is it not a duty to the survivors that we should refrain from augmenting their unhappiness by an appearance of immoderate grief? It is also a duty owed to yourself, for excessive sorrow prevents improvement or enjoyment, or even the discharge of daily usefulness, without which no man is fit for society." This advice, though good, was totally inapplicable to my case. I should have been the first to hide my grief and console my friends if remorse had not mingled its bitterness and terror, its very alarm with my other sensations. Now I could only answer my father with a look of despair and endeavor to hide myself from his view. Around this time, we retired to our house at Bellerive. This change was particularly agreeable to me. The shutting of the gates regularly at 10 o'clock and the impossibility of remaining on the lake after that hour had rendered our residence within the halls of Geneva irksome to me. I was now free. Often, after the rest of the family had retired for the night, I took the boat and passed many hours upon the water. Sometimes, with my sails set, I was carried by the wind, and sometimes after rowing into the middle of the lake, I left the boat to pursue its own course and gave way to miserable reflection. I was often tempted, when all was at peace around me, and I the only unquiet thing that wandered restless in a scene so beautiful and heavenly, if I except some bat or frogs whose harsh and interrupted croaking was heard only as I approached the shore, often at those times I was tempted to plunge into the silent lake, so that the waters might close over me and my calamities forever. But I was restrained when I thought of the heroic and suffering Elizabeth, who I tenderly loved and whose existence was bound in mine. I thought also of my father and surviving brother. Should I, by my base destruction, leave them exposed and unprotected to the malice of the fiend who I had set loose amongst them? At these moments I wept bitterly, and I wished that peace would revisit my mind, only that I might afford them consolation and happiness, but that could not be. Remorse extinguished every hope. I had been the author of unalterable evils, and I lived in daily fear lest the monster whom I had created should perpetuate some new wickedness. I had an obscure feeling that all was not over, and that he would still commit some signal crime which by its enormity should almost efface the recollection of the last. There was always scope for fear, as long as anything I loved remained. My abhorrence of this fiend cannot be conceived. When I thought of him, I gashed my teeth, my eyes became inflamed, and I ardently wished to extinguish that life that I had so thoughtlessly bestowed. When I reflected on his crimes and malice, my hatred and revenge burst all bounds of moderation. I would have made a pilgrimage to the highest peak of the Andes, could I, when there, have precipitated him to their base. I wished to see him again, that I might wreak the utmost extent of abhorrence upon his head and avenge the deaths of William and Justine. Our house was the house of mourning. My father's health was deeply shaken by the horror of the recent events. Elizabeth was sad and desponding. She no longer took delight in her ordinary occupations. All pleasure seemed to her sacrilege to the dead. Eternal woe and tears was what she then thought was a just tribute that she should pay to innocence so destroyed. She was no longer the happy creature who in her youth had wandered with me on the banks of the lake and talked with ecstasy about our future prospects. The first of these sorrows, which are sent to wean us from the earth, had visited her, and its dimming influence quenched her dearest smiles. "When I reflect, dear cousin," she said, "on the miserable death of Justine, I no longer see the world and its works as they appeared before me. Before, I looked upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I read in books or heard from others as tales of ancient days or imaginary evil. At least they were remote and more familiar to reason than to the imagination. But now misery has come home, and men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood. Yet I am certainly unjust. Everybody believed that poor girl to be guilty, and if she could have committed the crime for which she suffered, then assuredly she would have been the most depraved human creature. For the sake of a few jewels, to have murdered the son of her benefactor and friend, a child who she had nursed from his birth and appeared to love as though one of her own. I could not consent to the death of any human being, but certainly I should have thought such a creature unfit to remain in the society of men. But she was innocent. I know, I feel she was innocent, and you are of the same opinion, and that confirms it to me. Alas, Victor, when falsehood can look so like the truth, who can assure themselves of happiness? I feel as though I were walking on the edge of a precipice towards which thousands are crowding and endeavoring to plunge me into the abyss. William and Justine were assassinated, and the murderer escapes. He walks around the world free and perhaps even respected, but even if I were condemned to suffer on the scaffold for the same crime, I would not exchange places with such a wretch. I listened to this with extreme agony. I, not in deed, but in effect, was the murderer. Elizabeth read my anguish on my face, and kindly taking my hand, said, "My dearest friend, you must calm yourself. These events have affected me, God knows how deeply, but I am not so wretched as you. There is an expression of despair and sometimes of revenge on your face that makes me tremble. Dear Victor, banish these dark passions. Remember the friends around you who center all their hope on you. Have we lost the power of making you happy? Ah, well we love, well we are true to each other here in this land of peace and beauty. In your native country we may reap every tranquil blessing. What could disturb our peace?" And could not such words from her, whom I fondly prized before every other gift of fortune, suffice to chase away the fiend that lurked in my heart? Even as she spoke, I drew near to her, as though in terror, lest at that very moment be the destroyer close to me, robbing me of her. Thus, not the tenderness of friendship, nor the beauty of earth, nor of heaven, could redeem my soul from woe. The very accents of love were ineffectual. I was encompassed by a cloud which no beneficial influence could penetrate. The wounded deer dragging its fainting limbs on some untrodden brake, there to gaze upon the arrow which had pierced it and die. That was essentially me. Sometimes I could cope with the sullen despair that overwhelmed me, but sometimes the whirlwind passions of my soul drove me to seek, by bodily exercise and change of pace, some sort of relief from my intolerable sensations. It was during an excursion of this kind that I suddenly left my home, and bending my steps towards the near alpine valleys, sought in the magnificence, in the very eternity of these scenes, to forget myself and all in Faramel, because human sorrows are all in Faramel. My wanderings were directed towards the valley of the Charmeuse. I had visited it frequently during my boyhood. 6 years had passed since then. I was a wreck, but nothing had changed in those savage, enduring scenes. I performed the first part of my journey on horseback. After, I hired a mule, as the more sure-footed and least liable to become injured on these rugged roads. The weather was fine. It was about the middle of August, nearly 2 months after the death of Justine, that miserable epoch from which I dated all of my woes. The weight on my spirit was sensibly lightened as I plunged deeper into the ravine of the Arve. The immense mountains and precipices that overhung me on every side, the sound of the river raging among the rocks, and the dashing of the waterfalls all around, spoke of a power mighty as omnipotence, and I ceased to fear, or bend before anything less than the Almighty that had created and ruled the elements here. Still, as I ascended higher, the valley assumed a more magnificent and astonishing character. Ruined castles hanging on the precipices of piney mountains, cottages here and there peeping forth from among the trees, it formed a scene of singular beauty. But it was all augmented and rendered sublime by the mighty Alps, whose white shining pyramids and domes towered above us all, as if they belonged to another earth, a habitation of another race of beings. I passed the bridge of Pelissier, where the ravine from which the river forms opened before me, and I began to ascend the mountain that overhangs it. Soon after, I entered the valley of Chamois. This valley is more wonderful and sublime, but not as beautiful or picturesque as that of Cerveau, through which I had just passed. The high, snowy mountains were its immediate boundaries, but I saw no more ruined castles and fertile fields. Glaciers approached the road, and I heard the rumbling thunder of falling avalanches and marked the smoke of its passage. Mont Blanc, the supreme and magnificent Mont Blanc, raised itself from the other hills, and its tremendous dome overlooked the valley. A tingling, long-lost sense of pleasure often came across me during this journey. Some turn in the road, some new object suddenly perceived and recognized, reminded me of days gone by, and were associated with the light-hearted gaiety of boyhood. The very winds whispered in soothing accents, and maternal nature bade me to weep no more. Then again, the kindly influence would cease to act, and I found myself fettered again to grief and indulging in all of my misery and reflection. Then I spurred on my animal, striving so to forget the world, my fears, and more than all myself. Or, in a more desperate fashion, I would alight and throw myself on the grass, weighed down by my horror and despair. At length I arrived in the village of Charmou. Exhaustion succeeded the extreme fatigue of body and mind that I had endured. For a short time I remained at the window, watching the pallid lightnings that played above Mont Blanc, and listening to the rushing of the Arve, which pursued its noisy way beneath. The same lulling sounds acted like a lullaby to my too keen sensations, and when I placed my head upon the pillow, sleep overcame me. I felt it as it came, and I blessed it as the giver of all oblivion. And that is the end of chapter 1. And now I have to apologize. This is definitely where me not actually having read this book yet and just knowing that it at some point is going to give us the monster's point of view. This is where I am mistaken, and you can tell I have not read ahead. So it looks like we're still with Victor. I'm going to grab a drink and we're going to read chapter 2. Chapter 2. I spent the following day roaming through the valley. I stood beside the sources of the Aveyron, which take their rise in a glacier, with that slow pace advancing down from the summit of the hills to barricade the valley. The abrupt sides of the vast mountains were before me, the icy wall of the glacier overhung me, a few shattered pines scattered about, and the solemn silence of this glorious presence chamber of imperial nature was broken only by the brawling waves or the fall of some vast fragment, the thundering noise of the avalanche, or the crackling that reverberated along the mountains of accumulated ice, which, through the silent working of immutable law, was ever and anon rent and torn, as if it had been a plaything in their hands. These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was able to receive. They elevated me from all the littleness of feeling, and although they did not remove my grief, they subdued and tranquilized it. In some degree, also, they diverted my mind from the thoughts over which it had brooded for the last month. I retired to rest at night, my slumbers, as it were, waited on and ministered to by the assemblage of grand shapes which I had contemplated during the day. They congregated round me, the unstained snowy mountain top, the glittering pinnacle, the piney woods, the raggedy bare ravine, the eagle soaring amongst the clouds. They all gathered round and bade me be at peace. Where had they fled when the next morning I awoke? All of the soul-inspiriting fled with my sleep, and dark melancholy clouded every thought. The rain was pouring in torrents, and thick mist hid the summits of the mountains, so that I even saw not the faces of those mighty friends. Still, I would penetrate their misty veil and seek them in their cloudy retreats. What were rain and storm to me? My mule was brought to the door, and I resolved to ascend to the summit of Montvert. I remember the effect that the view of the tremendous and ever-moving glacier had produced upon my mind when I first saw it. Then it had filled me with a sublime ecstasy. It had given wings to my soul and allowed it to soar away from the obscure world to light and joy. The sight of the awful and majestic in nature had indeed always that effect of solemnizing my mind and causing me to forget the passing cares of life. I decided to go without a guide, for I was well acquainted with the path, and the presence of another would absolutely destroy the solitary grandeur of the scene. The ascent is precipitous, but the path is cut into continual and short windings, which enable you to surmount the perpendicularity of the mountain. It is a scene terrifically desolate. In 1,000 spots, the traces of the winter avalanche might be perceived, where trees lie broken and strewn upon the ground, some destroyed, others bent, leaning upon jutting rocks of the mountain, or traverse upon another tree. The path, as you go higher, is intersected by ravines of snow, down which stones continually roll from above. One is particularly dangerous, as the slightest sound, such as even speaking in a loud voice, produces a concussion of air sufficient to draw destruction upon the head of the speaker. The pines are not tall or luxuriant, but they are somber and add an air of severity to the scene. I looked long on the valley below, vast mist rising from the rivers which ran through it, curling in thick wreaths around the opposite mountains, whose summits had been hidden in the uniform cloud while rain poured from a dark sky and added to the melancholy impression that I received from everything around me. Alas! Why does man boast of sensibilities superior to these apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were just confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free, but now we are moved by every wind that blows, and a chance word or scene that might convey to us, we rest. A dream has power to poison sleep. We rise. One wandering thought pollutes the day. We feel, conceive or reason, laugh or weep, embrace fond woe, or cast our cares away. It is the same, for, be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure is still free. Man's yesterday may ne'er be like his morrow, naught may endure but mutability. It was nearly noon when I arrived at the top of the ascent. For some time I sat upon the rock that overlooks the sea of ice. A mist covered both. The mist, it covered the sea of ice and the surrounding mountains. Soon a breeze dissipated the cloud, and I descended upon the glacier. The surface is very uneven, rising like waves of a troubled sea, descending low and interspaced by rifts that sink deep. This field of ice is almost a league in width, but I spent nearly 2 hours in crossing it. The opposite mountain is a bare perpendicular rock. From the side where I now stood, Montanvert was exactly opposite, at the distance of a league, and up above it rose Mont Blanc, its awful majesty. I remained in a recess of rock, gazing on this stupendous scene. The sea, or vast river of ice, wound among its dependent mountains, whose aerial summits hang over its recesses. Their icy, glittering peaks shone in the sunlight that was above the clouds. My heart, which was previously sorrowful, now swelled with something akin to joy. I exclaimed, "Wandering spirits, if indeed you wander, and do not rest in your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me as your companion away from the joys of life." As I said this, I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance advancing towards me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of a man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me, but I was quickly restored by the cold gale off the mountains. I perceived, as the shape came nearer, a sight that was tremendous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait his approach and then close with him in mortal combat. He approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish combined with disdain and malignancy, while its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrid for human eyes. But I scarce observed this. Rage and hatred had at first deprived me of my voice, and I recovered only to overwhelm him with words expressive of furious detestation and contempt. "Devil!" I exclaimed. "Do you dare approach me? And do not you fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked upon your miserable head? Begone, insect, or rather stay, that I may trample you to dust, and oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims who you have so diabolically murdered." "I expected this reception," said the demon. "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art tied by bonds only dissolvable with the annihilation of one of us. You propose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death, until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." "Monster!" I said. "Fiend that thou art! The tortures of hell are too mild for your crimes, wretched devil, that you reproach me with your creation. Come on, then, that I might distinguish the spark that I so negligently gave you." My rage was without bounds. I sprang upon him, impelled by all the feelings which can arm one being against the existence of another. He easily eluded me and said, "Be calm. I entreat you to hear me before you give vent to your hatred upon my devoted head. Have I not suffered enough that you seek to increase my misery? Life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember, thou hast made me more powerful than you. My height is superior, my joints more supple, but I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to you. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if you will also perform your part, which you owe me. O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other and trample on me alone, to whom your justice and even clemency and affection is the most due. Remember, I am your creature. I ought to be your Adam, but I am more the fallen angel, who you drive from joy to misdeeds. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery has made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I will again be virtuous." "Begone," I said. "I will not hear you. There can be no community between you and me. We are enemies. Begone, or let us try our strength in a fight in which one will fall." "How can I move you?" said the creature. "Will no entreaties cause you to turn a favorable eye upon your creature who implores your goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity, but am I not alone? Miserably alone? You, my own creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures, all of whom owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains and the dreary glaciers are my refuge. I have wandered here many days. The caves of ice, which only I do not fear, are a home to me, and the only one which man does not begrudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your human beings. If the multitude of mankind knew of my existence, they would do as you do and arm themselves for my destruction. Should I not then hate those who hate me? I will keep no terms with my enemies. I am miserable, and they will share my wretchedness. But it is in your power to save me and deliver them from an evil which it only remains for you to make so great that not only you and your family, but others shall be swallowed by it in the whirlwind of rage. Let your compassion be moved, and do not disdain me. Listen to my tale. When you have heard it, abandon or commiserate with me as you judge I deserve, but hear me. The guilty are allowed by human laws, bloody as they are, to speak in their own defense before they're condemned. Listen to me, Frankenstein. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature? Praise the eternal justice of man. Yet I ask you not spare me. Listen to me, and then, if you can, and if you will, go ahead and destroy the work of your hands." "Why do you call to my remembrance," I said, circumstances of which I shudder to think upon, that I have been the miserable origin and author of this. Cursed be that day, you abhorred devil, in which you first saw light. Cursed, although I curse myself, be the hands that formed you. You have made me wretched beyond expression. You have left me no power to consider whether I am just to you or not. Begone. Relieve me from the sight of your detested form. Thus I will relieve thee, my Creator, he said. And he placed his hated hands before my eyes, which I flung away from me with violence. Thus I take from thee a sight which you abhor. Still, you can listen to me and grant my compassion. By the virtues that I once possessed, I demand this of you, he said. Hear my tale. It is long and strange, and the temperature of this place is not fitting to your fine sensations. Come to the hut upon the mountain. The sun is still high in the heavens. Before it descends to hide itself beyond the snowy precipices and illuminate another world, you will hear my story and can decide. On you it rests. Whether I quit forever the neighborhood of man and lead a harmless life, or whether I become the scourge of your fellow creatures and the author of your own speedy ruin. As he said this, he led the way across the ice, and I followed. My heart was full, and I did not answer him, but as I proceeded, I weighed the various arguments he had used, and determined at least to listen to his tale. This was partly by curiosity and compassion that confirmed my resolution. I had hitherto supposed him to be the murderer of my brother, and I eagerly sought a confirmation or denial of this. For the first time also, I felt what the duties of a creator towards his creation were, and should I not render him happy before complaining of his wickedness? These motives urged me to comply with his demand. We crossed the ice, therefore, and ascended to the opposite rock. The air was cold, and rain again began to descend. We entered the hut, the fiend with an air of exaltation, and I with a heavy heart and depressed spirits, but I consented to listen, and seating myself by the fire, which my odious companion had lighted, he began to tell his tale. And that is the end of chapter 2. Okay, so I wasn't entirely wrong. I just didn't know that we were going to get 2 chapters with Victor annoying me before we got to the monster, who does seem to have quite the tale to tell. Also, I love how Victor is trying to get compassion and everything from everyone around him, but not telling them why he is so upset. Because he knows very rightly that if he was like, yeah, I made a monster and I think it's what killed my brother, that his family would have words for him. Choice words. I think I do like the monster the best. Hashtag Team Monster. Anyway, thank you as always for listening. I hope that you enjoyed those first 2 chapters, and I will see you tomorrow for 2 more.